Hi, my name is Chen. I'm the Nomura Professor of Finance at MIT Sloan School of Management. It's my great honor to be able to share with some of my research with you today on this very special occasion which marks the 30th anniversary of the EPOC-MIT partnership. I'll start by telling you a true story, which helped me set up the research that I want to share with you a little bit later. So about 2 years ago, a former student of mine who was an executive MBA student got in touch with me and wanted to catch up. When he walked into my office, he told me that he is in the process of setting up a new company that aims to revolutionize agricultural finance with AI. Okay? So the market was massive, no doubt about that, and the mission was hugely important. But more importantly, he sees an opportunity because traditionally, investors have been reluctant to get into agricultural investing because of the lack of knowledge, expertise about agricultural finance, as well as the risks embedded in this agricultural field. Okay? That's why he thinks there's an opportunity to revolutionize this field. At that point, I was already thinking about where this conversation was going to be going. I was guessing that he will probably tell me that he and his team has already put together a large data set with tens of millions of loans made to farmers in the past, and he will build some kind of fancy deep learning algorithm that will be able to predict defaults more accurately and more efficiently than the standard methods, which are largely based on human intuition. On top of that, I was thinking that perhaps by that point I need to gently remind him to be really on guard for overfitting issues, which is a really notorious problem in the field of applying machine learning to finance. On top of that, he probably needs to watch out for structural breaks in the data because, after all, this is a quickly evolving market. But turns out that's not the kind of problems he was coming to talk to me about. The problem he was trying to tackle actually are a lot more challenging, but also more interesting. As you know, these are the favorite kind of problems we would like to have here at MIT. To start, they actually don't have tens of millions of past records of loans that made to the farmers. Okay? It turns out that the agriculture finance has become much more specialized in the past 20 years, including in the South American markets that their company is targeting. What they do have, however, is deep domain knowledge about agriculture itself. For example, their team have already taken a deep dive to collect a lot of information, granular information, of everything from, say, local soil productivity, past records of yields of different types of crops, to information such as local and national weather patterns, potential risks of supply chain disruptions, and threats coming from climate change. Also, of course, they're also collecting personal information about the farmers, including their financial records, as well as something that the fintech industry refers to as digital footprints. For example, is a farmer likely to spend more time at their favorite local bars, buying alcohol after midnight? Okay? Turns out, surprise, surprise, consuming too much alcohol after midnight is a bad sign for your credit. Moreover, his business model is actually kind of unique. His goal is not to replace the existing players in the field by starting making agricultural loans himself. Rather, he wants to be a facilitator. He wants to help existing players to make better loan decisions. He also wants to help direct more investment into this area by making the securitization process more efficient. And by that, I basically mean that if you can do the securitization well, it can actually help standardize the investment product and the diversified idiosyncratic risks in your loan portfolios better, so that the risk-return trade-off can become more appealing to the mass investor base. So to him, the goal of the machine learning algorithm is not just to be able to predict individual farmers' default risk more accurately. Instead, he wants the algorithm to speak better to his business objective, which is to be able to make better loan decisions, as well as to be more effectively putting together loan portfolios for securitization. Ultimately, the question becomes, how can we integrate the machine learning methods with economic decision making more effectively? The second question is just as intriguing. As it turns out, a big part of their initiative and a major comparative advantage, as he sees it, is that they want to be able to bring more farmers onto their mobile app platforms so that they can educate farmers on the best practices of farming, as well as to educate them to improve their credit profiles. On top of that, they also want to be more transparent about the lending algorithms that's working in the background so as to build trust with the farmers. But this does bring up a potential problem. When the farmer sees what's going on in the black box that determines their credit decisions, could that actually generate some kind of incentive for the farmers to to manipulate their information, right? So as to game the algorithm. For example, instead of actually cutting back on the number of trips to a local bar midnight, what if the farmers realize all they need to do is just change the method of payment, right? They consume just as much alcohol after midnight, but instead of leaving a trail by paying with credit card, they pay with cash. That's certainly not the intention of this kind of a farmer education, but it could be the strategic response of the farmer, certainly the least costly one from the economic perspective. So the second question is, how can we make our lending algorithms more robust to potential strategic attacks? Let's go back to the first question, okay? How to better integrate machine learning algorithms with economic decision making. One of the most famous success cases of modern machine learning is in computer vision, in particular in teaching the computer to recognize a picture of a cat. Okay? As it turns out, the modern deep learning based algorithms have become so successful that they are actually more accurate to most human beings on this particular task of recognizing objects in the picture, which is truly remarkable. However, most of the time, we're not making forecasts for the sake of making forecasts. Instead, these kind of forecasts derived by machine learning algorithms are used as the inputs to aid our decision making. For example, think about the agricultural financing example, right? There we're trying to make forecasts about credit defaults of individual farmers, but ultimately these predictions coming from the models are used as the input to help us decide whether we should lend to a particular farmer or not, or how much to lend. In this case, because the data are noisy, or the signal to noise ratio is very low, it is particularly important to try to understand the type of mistakes that our algorithms can make, which are of two kinds, the false positives and false negatives. Let me give you an example that's perhaps more familiar to try to explain these concepts. Okay? So think about COVID-19 testing. If a perfectly healthy person was tested and the test result was positive, that's clearly a false positive mistake. Similarly, if a person has already been infected by the virus, yet the test result turned out to be negative, that's going to be a false negative. You can use the same logic to analyze the type of mistakes that our lending algorithm can make. The goal of our lending algorithm is to try to detect bad borrowers. So if a good borrower was turned away and this application was rejected, that's going to be a false positive mistake. Similarly, if a bad borrower was not detected by the algorithm and we end up lending money to the bad borrower, that's going to be a false negative mistake. Obviously, both mistakes are undesirable, and we would like to reduce those type of mistakes as much as possible. But one feature I want to emphasize here is that these two types of mistakes actually carry very different economic consequences. Let's think about the false positive mistake in the case of agricultural lending, right? In that case, you are turning away a good farmer. That is bad, but it's basically a lost business opportunity, so certainly not devastating. Right? We have a lot more farmers that we can potentially lend to. On the other hand, in the case of false negative mistake, we end up lending money to a bad borrower, and if that loan ends up in default, which is going to be more likely than usual, we're going to potentially not going to be able to recover our principal investments. So the losses coming from the false negative mistakes can be many times bigger than the potential gains of lending to a good borrower. So what should we do? Well, we need an economic framework that can help us balance the two types of mistakes. It is true that our lending algorithm will probably not be able to simultaneously reduce both types of mistakes, but at least we can teach the algorithm which type of mistake that it needs to pay more attention to depending on the economic consequence. So this is where my recent research comes in, where we derive an economic loss function framework that teaches the learning algorithm exactly how to pay attention to different types of mistakes in a systematic manner. Intuitively, let's think about our lending algorithm example again. Right? So there, as I just explained, the false positive mistakes, which amounts to losing a good customer, is probably going to be generating a loss that is many times smaller than the false negative mistake, which is lending money to a bad borrower. If that's the case, then the intuition tells us that we should direct our algorithm to pay more attention to minimize the false negative mistakes. But that's not all of it. The base rate also matters. And here the base rate refers to just how many good borrowers are there in our market versus the bad borrowers. Right? Are we more likely to encounter a bad borrower than a good borrower? If it turns out that we're operating in a market where bad borrowers have a higher fraction, then put it together, the probability of making a false negative mistake is going to be even higher. That means that we should pay even more attention to minimize the false negative mistakes compared to false positive mistakes. Okay? As it turns out, the economic loss function tells us how to train these machine learning algorithms in a way that automatically takes into account these kind of economic trade-offs. And that's what makes these performance significantly better, as our results show, compared to the standard way to train these learning algorithms. Let's turn to the second question, which is how to make our machine learning algorithms more robust to strategic attacks. Okay? On the surface, this sounds like a very challenging problem because, after all, machine learning is all about detecting and generalizing the statistical relationships in the past data and then apply it to future data. And there's a very important stationarity assumptions embedded in this practice. Now, if you consider strategic attacks, that's basically saying that the way the data are being generated are fundamentally different, which means that the past relationships we learned in the old data are no longer valid in the new data. That seems to running the risk of making the previously trained algorithm behave or perform significantly worse in the new data. And that's indeed a big danger here. Fortunately, the gaming behavior itself is actually predictable to some extent. In fact, a big part of economics as a discipline is to try to study how economic agents respond to incentives. In the case of the agricultural lending, the farmers are trying to game the algorithms by improving their credit decision outcomes. Right? That's their way of responding to economic incentives. And our goal here is to basically try to model these kind of economic incentives and better anticipate what farmers' behavior would be. Specifically, what my research does is to borrow a page from game theory and to try to set up a machine learning algorithm inside a game between borrowers and lenders. Think about the lenders as the first mover in this game. Right? They're the ones who are going to be announcing a new lending algorithm based on which they're going to be screening which borrowers to lend to and which borrower to reject. The borrowers, seeing the new algorithm, would try to re-optimize their behavior. For example, if they learn that late night visits to the local bars is a bad idea, they could either cut back on that kind of behavior, which is a great thing, or maybe they just change the method of payments to try to avoid the tracking, which is not going to be so great. So the real interesting part of this research is that we showed that in the equilibrium of this game, the lenders who are the first movers are going to try to strategically anticipate what borrower is going to do. Okay? So for example, if there are attributes that can be easily manipulated because the cost of manipulations are low, they should actually optimally reduce the importance of these kind of attributes in their final algorithm. If on the other hand, the attributes are difficult to manipulate, for example, your income, your education, these kind of attributes that are difficult to change, those are the information they can rely more importantly on. And this is regardless how these attributes demonstrate informativeness in the old data where manipulation is absent. So for example, the lenders will recognize that they should not be relying so much on attributes such as late night visits to the local bars, because these kind of attributes can be easily manipulated, even if these attributes show up to be very informative about the eventual credit outcomes in the old data. Our research presents a computational framework that help people compute these kind of robust algorithms embedded in this kind of game between borrowers and the lenders. And they can obviously be applied to many other settings as well, such as the health insurance companies' screening of people's health behavior. We also actually extend the work to study the optimal algorithm transparency that balances out between the fairness requirements, the need to build trust, as well as the strategic behavior that can potentially elicit. I would love to dig deeper into each of these research I just talked about in the last 10 minutes or so, but unfortunately, time is limited here. But as you can tell, I'm very excited about the potential of better integrating economics into AI and machine learning. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your support to MIT. This kind of partnership is exactly what keeps us going strong in our research on campus. MIT is truly a magical place. I sincerely hope that our partnership will be going strong in the next 30 years. Thank you very much.